up, actually.
Oh, terrific. Glad to hear that. Oh, man.
Just realized I brought my Lion King mug up here, so don't judge me.
Perfect.
Yeah.
I love the Lion King. Okay. I think we're live now.
Okay.
Let me just see if the link is working, and then we can get started. Do-do-do. What have you been up to during this quarantine?
I am locked in a house, a semi-detached house with a 9-year-old and a 5-year-old, which would be like
So
sharing a Alcatraz prison cell with 2 live Wolverines.
so busy, to say the
Yeah,
least.
no, absolutely. Yeah, and then working and stuff like that. So,
Yeah.
but mostly trying to keep them from killing each other.
Well, I'm sure that that's quite challenging.
Yeah, no murder charges yet. An indictment is not the same as a conviction.
Exactly. If they don't see it, they can't know.
Exactly. It's only illegal if you get caught.
That's what I always say. Okay, so we're live. Okay. Okay. So we'll just wait for a couple of people to join, and then we'll get right on started.
Sounds good.
Did you by chance have any B-roll or photos or anything that you'd be willing to share for us? It's totally okay if no. We just
I'm
had
a
to let
print
Mary
guy.
know.
I'm a print guy, so I don't have a lot of B-roll floating around.
Okay, no worries.
And photos, I mean, if you have a face like this, you don't tend to pose for a lot of photos. So no, I
Oh,
don't have
why
a ton.
not? Okay, perfect. No
But
worries.
yeah, I mean, if you desperately need some, I can find some. But
Okay.
just
I think we should be good with whatever
okay.
this content is, but yeah, I will definitely email you and let you know.
I definitely know there'd be no B-roll, but photos, I mean, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, so Sean, we'll just get started now if that's okay with you.
Yep.
All right, so thank you so much for taking the time to do this, being here. So to start things off, what is the biggest change you've seen in journalism and in the sports world, in the sports industry?
Are you talking like since 8 a.m. this morning? Because it seems like something's changing every day.
Um,
Yeah, no, I was at Ryerson University in 1996 as a freshman. And back then, the campus newspaper had one computer that was hooked up to the internet, and it was dial up. And today, obviously, here we are all talking from quarantine and self isolation and social distancing across the internet. So there's one. Two, the industry, didn't really keep pace with the changes that we just talked about. So it's kind of struggling. And three, the nature of the relationship economically and technologically between sports, the sports media, and the sports we cover has fundamentally changed. It's just a huge difference. We can honestly, if you really wanted to, we could spend the whole hour talking about how it's changed.
yeah. I completely agree with what you're saying about the whole technological shift. Could you go a little bit more in depth about how that relationship with sports has changed and developed over time?
Sure. I mean, from a journalistic and consumer point of view, let's take a look back. You don't even have to go that far back. Let's say 15 years. It's still a long time, but
Yeah.
so 15 years ago, the Toronto Maple Leafs are practicing, and Matt Sundin breaks a breaks a nail. Like he's on a breakaway and he breaks a nail and he's ouch, that hurts. Today, you would have people tweeting about it immediately. Like your phone would be stacked with, oh my God, here's somebody from TSN. Matt Sundin just hurt his finger. Sportsnet, what does this finger mean for the Swedish team at the next Olympics? Every angle is covered almost instantaneously. But as recently as 15 years ago, the only way that you really know it, the only delivery mechanism for that would have been the Fan 590 had a sports update every 20 minutes. So you'd tune into Howard Berger, and every 20 minutes he'd say, "Hey guys, Matt Sundin just hurt himself." And the only way that everybody else would have a chance to deliver that would be the evening news at 6 p.m. and then the 11 p.m. and then you have your sports centers and your Sportsnet connecteds, and then the newspapers would weigh in the following morning, and then maybe Toronto Life would weigh in with a big feature 3 months down the road. So the immediacy has changed the information. It's changed the value of the information. It's changed some information to become commodity information, which is very disposable. That a line change at practice, whereas before it might have been worth a full story on SportsCenter that night, or a full story or a full column in the newspaper the next day. That's already gone almost instantaneously because people are talking about it on social media. So there's that, and then the relationship between the media and the teams themselves has also changed because the team owns the content, and it's generally now also starting to control the medium. So the teams tweet out videos, the teams tweet out the links, the lines, all of this stuff. That there's a bit of a rivalry. I don't know if the rivalry is the right word, but definitely more of a competitive environment almost between what the team would view as maybe proprietary information versus what would get out. So sometimes a team might make a trade. You see this a lot in Europe with soccer, that the team will make a move or somebody will be injured, and somebody from the team will only talk to the in-house broadcaster rather than, say, in the UK, BBC or Sky News. That's not quite here yet, but I mean, maybe that's the next step. The teams take a lot of their content in-house.
Okay, and how, as a sports journalist, do you kind of navigate those loyalties to certain or specific, like players' loyalties to certain or specific organizations, or them creating even just like their own content and their own news in that way? Like, how do you report off of that?
It's a huge pain in the ass.
I would bet.
And I mean, the first responsibility you have is to your audience. So whether that's TV or print or radio, the first one is the audience. So you have to find the best, I hate to say this, but content. In the old days, it used to be story, but best content to deliver to your audience. So no matter what the teams want to do, no matter how much they want to shield their players, you have to find a way to get the story. So if the story is Kyle Lowry's injured, he's disappeared from the team, the team's not making him available to speak, how do you get that information? Do you just say, well, the team's not allowing him to speak, or do you push on? Do you start calling, where Kyle Lowry's from? tracking down as concentric circles of friends, family, agents, representatives, to get somebody to tell you that. So that could be something that the team doesn't want. It would be something that they wouldn't like, might even be something the player wouldn't like, but your responsibility is to your audience. So you are beholden to them, and you have to do the best you can to get that story no matter how.
So the gatekeeping of these teams is kind of a little more intense now that there's so many people trying to report on so many things for so many different reasons.
And that's the interesting thing. I don't even know if it's volume necessarily that, the media has contracted. Like we're seeing it now. I mean, minute by minute, sadly, that, the media is contracting. It's molting. It's changing. I mean, I'm working for a company that didn't exist 5 years ago.
Yeah.
So I don't know if it's numbers. Like, in 2002, back when the Leafs used to make the playoffs semi-regularly and go deep, you'd have Darcy Tucker or Matt Sundin or Ty Domi or Paul Healy or whoever would talk to more reporters than the Premier of Ontario. That's not hyperbole, like every day.
Wow.
I don't know if the volume is the thing. I think that there's so much more money at stake. You're looking at partnerships, rights fees, branding is now a thing. It wasn't a thing then. The media relations has become so professionalized that it's really influenced sports from top to bottom. That now that you have these multi-billion-dollar multinational corporations fully invested in sports teams, it's not just the same as Joe Schmo or Jane just sort of sitting there at her stall while we all talk about the game. There's so much more to it now.
That's very interesting to hear about, actually. So as a coach and a father, how has your involvement in sports, mainly recreational hockey, influenced your work as a journalist?
Well, lately, not a lot.
Yeah.
Sitting around trying to keep my children from killing each other at mini sticks
Yes.
downstairs. No, it's interesting. We have a 9-year-old and a 5-year-old. They're both in hockey here in Toronto. The 5-year-old is not yet in prison, but soon. And she is in hockey school. So she's at the entry point. He is 9, so he's in novice, was in novice, and theoretically at some point will be going into minor Adam, assuming hockey ever restarts.
Yeah.
What that is sort of the perspective is that, we see the game so often at the top. So what we see on Sportsnet or TSN or CBC, that's the top. This is a different view. This is the bottom of the ladder looking up and seeing it, all of the hurdles and the obstacles. I'm mixing my metaphors. All of the things that the parents and players have to navigate on their way up to get to the show. And I'm not saying my child is going to the show. He's not. He inherited my hands, and that's my fault. But it's the hockey schools, it's the cost, it's the time commitment. Every time you see a kid, fresh-faced 18-year-old at the NHL draft, and they say, I just want to thank my parents for all that stuff that they did. It's easy to sort of say, okay, well, yeah, of course, parents do stuff. But like, holy shit. He just turned 9. So we had him in spring hockey last year. We had him in 3 week-long summer camps, and they're each $800 a piece. We had him on a skating treadmill that used to be at Ryerson University. So it's just like
Wow.
You're on a treadmill running, right? Except your skates are there and you're pushing off, and you have an instructor, and she's a magnificent.
Wow.
And she's working on the stride. He was 8. It's
insane.
$50 an hour. And it's also an hour out of your day. So I could be very happily lying on my couch watching soccer or, eating my 5th tube of Pringles that day, but I'm out driving him to hockey or whatever.
Yeah.
And it's just starting. So next year he joins the GTHL, again, assuming hockey resumes. So there's going to be more camps, more skill development, more equipment costs, more pressure, more everything. Does he have the right skating instructor, skills instructor? Does he have the, at some point, maybe the right nutritionist, the right sports psychologist? And these are all before you get to the Ontario Hockey League or Junior B. Like, the professionalization of sports all the way down is something that I never would have known had I not become a hockey parent.
Yeah. So do you think that becoming a hockey parent has really influenced the way that you're writing about maybe issues among sports, especially for youths?
Definitely need to write more to make more money, to pay for the minor hockey.
It's all full circle.
Right. Exactly. Circle of life. Yeah, it's interesting. Like it's this whole other side of it. It's that, I'm 43, so I'm pretty old. But none of this stuff was around when I was a kid. And I was a dog shit hockey player, so I was never going to be part of any of this. But, the team that our son played on this year, I was an assistant coach, and every Wednesday we had a professional goalie coach come work with our goalie.
Oh,
And
wow.
we had a professional skills and skating coach come out and work with our skaters. And this is a team that's trending towards playing double A. So it's not even triple A. It's not even the height of minor hockey. And it's not leading the way. Like, this was just something that our team leadership decided to do just to keep pace with everybody else in Toronto. Like, think about it. Like, 8 years old, we don't have our kids working with a math tutor 1 hour every week, but we
Yeah,
have them working with a pro skating instructor, because if you're 10 years old, you don't know how to use the outside edge of your right blade, then you're hooped.
exactly. So it's kind of all just making sure that they have the skills that they need, but also trying to find that balance too.
Or hockey parents are just batshit crazy. But yeah, one of those two. I like yours. I like your way of putting it better. It makes me feel
Yeah.
better. I'll
Well,
be able to
yeah,
sleep better at night when I do my taxes and see how much we spent on that.
I'm glad to hear that. So now getting into your book a little bit, called Before the Lights Go Out. It's about the trials and tribulations of the sports world for youths. And you look into answers as to why the youth sports such as hockey are struggling to get new participants. So how has this impacted you as a father with children in hockey, as a coach who experiences it, and as a journalist who reports on it?
Yeah, it's fundamentally changing the way Canadians relate to a game that for so long we've identified with. This was the game that was supposed to be for everybody. I mean, again, even that's kind of selective, because if you
Yeah.
go back, it's only half the population that really had access to hockey for a long time, and luckily that's been fixed for the most part. But for so long, you could mark what generation you were part of by what goal you identified with most. So if you're even older than me, maybe 1972 and Paul Henderson scoring in the Summit Series, schools closed down, people watch games in gymnasiums. Like, you remember where you were. For me, it was the goal in 1987. For other people, maybe it was 2004. And for others still, it was Sidney Crosby's goal in 2010. Like, that's benchmarks of Canadian generations. Like, boomers, Gen X, Gen Y, millennials, Gen Z, by what goal they remembered most. The game was on the back of our $5 bill for years and years and years. So much of how we identify as Canadians is tied to this game. But the things that we've already started talking about just here in this conversation, the cost, the time commitment, the barriers to entry, who's entering, the fact that entire communities are not being represented inside the arena, yet, are helping shape the way that Canada as a whole is heading. That you can walk into a rink in Toronto and feel like you're in Burlington or Whitby in 1976, and then walk out, it's like, oh no, I'm still in Toronto. Why don't these two communities intermingle here? It's a real problem, and hockey doesn't represent as many Canadians as it did before. So that fundamental shift was something that was really interesting to me. It was, really interesting to be able to track that over 3 years of writing the book, and really being able to say without fear of hyperbole or being shouted down at the pub that unless significant changes are made, hockey's going to lose its tether. It's going to lose its hold on our collective consciousness as Canadians.
So what do you think can be done to kind of fix that problem? Is there anything in specific that you personally have in mind, or things that other countries like youth programs have kind of integrated into their youth sports realm?
Yeah, I mean, how long do we have here? We have are we talking till the end of the lockdown here? Because there are a lot of things that we can do. The question is, is there ability to implement it properly? So here's one.
Okay.
Talking about accessibility. So this isn't addressing cost, though we can get into cost in a second. So the fundamental problem is there are a lot of Canadians and a lot of communities who aren't represented in the arenas anymore. That you walk in, you're like, holy shit, like, am I in Pleasantville? That old movie, it's like everything's
Yeah.
black and white,
Yeah.
mostly white. How do we fix that? So let's go back to Peterborough for a real world example, based not indirectly, but not entirely off the concept for the book. But
Yeah.
in Peterborough, the Petes last season, I guess we call it last season now, had a really interesting idea. And they have a young woman named Shelby Kilcollins, who's in the book. A really great idea, boundless energy, really smart. She's going to run the world one day. She had the idea of, look, before a Pete's game, why don't we open up the ice for 2 hours before warm-ups, and we'll have two sessions, two 1-hour sessions. and we'll open it up to new Canadians who have never had the opportunity to skate, play hockey. So what she did was she went around and she went into the Pete's locker rooms, not the active one, but their storage room, and got all the old skates. Then she asked the coaches, front office workers to say, give me your old skates. And then she went around to all the arenas, into the lost and founds, and said, give me your old skates. And then went to friends and would answer ads on Kijiji that were offering skates and equipment for free. So in the end, I think she ended up with somewhere between 60 and 80 pairs of skates, 60 and 80 pairs of gloves, 60 to 80 helmets and sticks. And she also coaches a AA girls, I want to say it's Pee Wee team, and had them come out on their night off from practice to come out and just sort of help. So people couldn't stand these kids, help the folks skate around. And so that was phase one. And she drove around, like literally drove through snowstorms over Christmas to get like a free pair of skates that somebody was offering on Kijiji. So that was step one. Step two, well, maybe not, I'm going to get the steps mixed up, but the other part was she connected with the New Canadian Center in Peterborough. And this place is a not-for-profit, and it's absolutely essential. So if your grandmother is 67 and she's just retiring, but she was born in England, and all of a sudden at 67 says, holy shit, I don't have the right documentation to get my CPP, the New Canadian Center will help. It's also the same center that if you've just arrived in Canada from Syria or Southeast Asia or South America, they'll help you get your social insurance number, get your kids registered for school, get your health plan. Like they do such essential work. And they also have a direct line into these new and emerging communities in Peterborough, which is a pretty old white town. Yeah. So the Pete's connected with the New Canadian Center to say, we're doing this. Can you send anybody who's interested, who doesn't have a lot of experience skating, send them on down to us. So before a game this season, they had 60 new Canadians come onto the ice and try hockey. Just no cost, no need for anything other than just showing up. And what they did was they went around and just rudimentary skating, what it felt like to be on skates on the ice. And some of the kids had a lot of fun. So the next phase of this would be, so you have the Pete's connected to the New Canadian Center. You have to complete that triangle, that circuit, by connecting to the Minor Hockey Association in that city. So you have the Pete's, which are the flag bearers for hockey in a lot of ways in Peterborough, connecting to the New Canadian Center. If you can connect that with the Peterborough Hockey Association, so you capitalize on the interest by following up with real programming, saying you had fun skating here, why not try hockey for a 6 or 2 month trial? What you've done then is you've invited other communities into the rink and said, look, this is the Peterborough Memorial Center. For 62 years, this is where the Pete's have played. This is our home in Peterborough. Welcome home. So what you've done then is you've created and fostered a broader sense of community. That's one. That's really important, and that's across Canada. Two, and I'll be briefer on this one, is the economic cost. So let's go back to Peterborough in this hypothetical situation. So the PHA, Peterborough Hockey Association, is connected with the Pete's and connected with the New Canadian Center. How can it facilitate that new interest? How can it help those new Canadians get gear? Because gear it's not as expensive as I think we like to make it seem. Like you can find affordable gear. But the thing is if you've never been exposed to hockey, like, how do you know what gear you need? Do the shin pads go on before the pants? Do the skates go on before the elbow pads? Like, who knows? There's a lot. Yeah. So another idea that could sort of complement that is, in a lot of Ontario high schools, I think probably all of them, if you want to play football, you don't have your own helmet. You don't have your own shoulder pads. You show up in grade 9 or 10 or whatever it is you feel you want to really hurt yourself and play football. And you go and you say, I want to be a football player. So before training camp starts, you go into a big room and a coach and a volunteer is there saying, here's your helmet, here's your shoulder pads, here's how they latch on, here's how you put the pads in your pants. Go get your own cleats. You're a football player. So why can't hockey associations do something like that where, here even in East York or in Peterborough, kids at 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 have a really, really annoying habit of growing. Like they get bigger. It's really annoying. It's expensive. It's messy. And, for hockey players, it's especially acute because those cute little shin pads you got for the 4-year-old look like thimbles by the time they're 7. So why not? And they're not roughly used. So why not donate those shin pads back to the Hockey Association in exchange for a modest rebate for your registration fee next year? And what that allows the Hockey Association to do is build this library, this sort of depot of hockey equipment that they can then within a year, I bet, could turn around and say, okay, We have space for 60 full sets of gear at these different sizes. Come on in. We'll show you, the kids and the parents, how to put it on. And it's yours for the year. You sign out this hockey bag, it's yours for the year. So here's the programming, here's the gear, here's a connection with, the new Canadian Center. Come on out and try hockey. That's just one example.
That's a really good idea, actually. I'm not really sure. So why do you think that teams or other teams are not following the same sort of lead that the Peterborough Petes have kind of set into motion?
Hockey is plagued in a lot of ways by inertia.
Okay.
This is the way it's always been. It's starting to change. And I think, if you're looking for slivers of optimism, that, folks at the highest level understand that there's challenges, that, Tom Rennie understands all of the things that we're talking about here. Phil McKee, who's the head of the Ontario Hockey Federation, understands there's challenges here. The issue is, how do you implement any substantive change? The minor hockey associations are generally run by exceptionally well-meaning, civic-minded volunteers. They drive your buses. They might be a local lawyer. They might, be a journalist. They might do a whole bunch of things, and they're volunteering. So they might not have, a lot of knowledge about marketing or about community outreach, that, they want to help by putting on programming. So they might not have the background in some of the things that, we'd be asking them. And I say we, meaning people advocating change, would like to see. So they need to have proper support from Hockey Canada, from the member umbrellas down, saying, here's a template, here's a booklet, follow this booklet and expand. And here's some of the ideas you can sort of put in. Because right now, the challenge is that some of these boards and minor hockey associations can be run by boards or executives. They've been in place for decades. And they're well-meaning volunteers who spend their time, in cold, dark rinks all winter long, implementing program for the community. They might be stretched already just to deliver that programming. Asking them to do something more might be a step beyond. And I think that's one of the reasons that this change has been kind of slow in arriving.
Okay. Sorry, just want to jump around here a little bit. So kind of branching off of, so you mentioned Tom Rennie, who's the CEO of Hockey Canada.
Mm-hmm.
So when Austin Matthews decided not to play in the CHL and went to Zurich instead, other junior North American players started to choose to play elsewhere as well, with the latest example being the Fantilli brothers, committing to Chicago Steel instead of the OHL. So why do you think these junior players are choosing this path of development rather than something else?
You want to avoid a bus trip to Sudbury in February? Maybe? I don't know.
I guess so.
I mean, that's part of it. No, that's the thing, is that hockey, they like to, at the top levels, they like to market that this is for everybody, that hockey is a global game. It's not, but this could be one of the manifestations, that there's more options for players, that, if you go back to the original six, like, teams owned your rights from the time that you were of voting age until the time that you were dead, and there's nothing you could do. This could be, the growth of some of these opportunities as the game does grow in the United States, that you can find reasonable places to play. I still think that, with the draw of, say, the GTHL, Greater Toronto Hockey League, and with it being such an obvious feeder system for the Canadian Hockey League, that the CHL will always will have that leverage to say, look, like, the infrastructure is here, the scouting's here. This is still the place to sort of hone your craft. But I mean, the NCAA is sort of making headway, and these other developmental leagues, as the game grows, it logically holds to reason that, they'll start developing and producing players too. That, California, I haven't been able to confirm this, but somebody was saying that, their number of registered youth players might be approaching some of the numbers we're seeing in the Northeast in the United States, the traditional powers like Michigan or Massachusetts.
Okay, that's really interesting. So what is it that makes you think that hockey is so special and worth holding on to and worth saving and worth implementing all of these different roles? Like, why is this a sport that us as Canadians even should still be cherishing if there's so many tribulations to it?
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know if it should. I mean, put Darwin at the wheel and see what happens. The reason I think it's worth examining is because of what it's meant to everybody, my generation, people who come before us, people now, of what it's meant. That, even still in this giant frozen half of North America, there's not a lot that brings us all together regularly. We complain about whoever's in Ottawa. We have Tim Hortons, we have universal healthcare, and what? Hockey? And then like the list is pretty short of what tethers us all together. So, keeping in mind the fact that we've talked about like the 1972 goal, the 1987 goal, the golden goal in 2010, the fact that, assuming a Canadian team will ever make the playoffs and go deep again, that, all the people who might be watching, that's not something to be discounted. Does that mean that hockey absolutely has to be saved over every other activity? No. But it's worth noting what it's meant to us historically as Canadians, as per our identity. It still has a tremendous power to bring together communities. That I live in East York. I live in a part of the most diverse, most populous city in all of Canada. And being involved in minor hockey makes it feel like a small town. That we can go to parks again if they ever reopen, or other rinks if they ever reopen. And there's a real good chance that our kids will know somebody just through competing and playing and participating in minor hockey.
So it just kind of creates that environment, even if it's a smaller one, it creates a sense of community. Yeah,
the challenge is that the community looks a lot like the two folks who are talking right now, and that needs to change.
Absolutely, I agree. All right, thank you so much. We're just going to take a couple of audience questions now, if that's okay.
Sure.
Awesome. So this one comes from Cheska. So why is it important for sports journalism to be more than just sports?
That's a really good question. I didn't set out to be a sports journalist. I was just going to be a regular journalist. I started at National Post in 2000, and I was in the Toronto section. So covering everything from the boat show to some criminal matters to everything else. I'd be just as happy covering municipal politics because that's pretty shady sometimes and it's a lot of fun. So I think that the most important part of sports journalism is to remember that, the sports part, it's just a prefix, that the word itself is journalism, that, you don't get caught up into the car wash of PR and spin, or at least you fight against it as much as possible, and try and just do your job as a journalist, tell the story. Remember that you are beholden to your audience and to nobody else. Critically, and that you use all the tools that you're picking up in journalism as journalism students and apply it to sports, just like you would if you're at, City Hall or the police beat. That, again, you have agents, you have stakeholders, you have corporate sponsors, you have team PR. It really is becoming a lot more like, say, the entertainment industry, which it is part of. But you have to remember that you're a journalist first.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So the next one.
Ha. Ha. Yeah. Is it imperative to be personally good at a sport to effectively report on it as a sports journalist? No.
No.
I am just utter trash at sports. I play beer league twice a week. I bring shame on the family name every time I put skates on. I am just garbage at sports. No, you don't have to be good at sports. I mean, do you have to understand them? Sure, yes. But you don't have to be an expert in them to become a hockey reporter. You just have to be committed to becoming an expert. That if you're a good journalist, you're going to talk to experts. You're going to do your best to study, to learn. I don't cover a lot of baseball. I just don't. It's just how it worked out. If they turned around and said, you have to be a baseball reporter, I would do my best. I'd probably, the first thing I do is I go out to the Ontario Baseball Association, or OBF, or whatever it's called, and just sit down with whoever's running it and say, teach me about, arm velocity and arm slots and exit velocity and all that stuff, and try and build my knowledge of the sport. It doesn't mean I can throw for a damn, but I want to try and understand what it is I'm watching. Just as you would if, you show up to court and you're covering a civil trial, or you're covering a criminal trial, and you're like, what does that mean? Like, you don't know, you're not a lawyer, but you're a journalist, so you're going to go ask the lawyer, what does that mean? It's the same thing.
So it's just always about familiarizing yourself with what you're reporting on. You don't necessarily need to be the most knowledgeable, just as long as you have enough to get by, sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's to be a journalist, I really do think that it starts with one, you have to be curious. You have to have a
Yep.
base level of curiosity that you have to want to know the answers to the questions you're asking. We all watch, scrums, and it's not just sports, but in politics, where somebody will have their tape recorder in here, and they'll just sort of see them. They're not paying attention to who they're watching, right? Like
Yeah.
they're looking off. They're not necessarily fully engaged. To be a journalist, you need to want to know the answer. You need to be curious. Like this a story that went up today, and I'm only saying this because it went up today, not because it's a
Yeah.
great story, but there was an old Canadian movie that came out in 1983 called Strange Brew with Bob and Doug McKenzie, the hosers, Take Off, and all that stuff.
Yeah.
I did a story today about the hockey scenes in it and how hockey sort of influenced the movie.
Yeah.
And in part of because I was deeply curious about it. So I tracked down the cinematographer, one of the writers, and asked them, like, what about this scene? What inspired you here? What about the costume choices? What about the lighting choices? Because I was legitimately curious. I wanted to know the answer. So as a journalist, you need to have that curiosity. And then the other part of that is to get back to sort of circling whether you need to be good at the sport. With that curiosity, it needs to be paired with sort of a hyperdrive for research that, if you are going to court, or if you're going to cover a hockey practice, or you're going to cover a city council meeting, or the fall tulip festival in small town Ontario, you need to spend some time researching so that you know as much as you can about fucking tulips before you go out there. So you don't go and say, hey, tell me about tulips. Like, you need to go and have an idea of what you're covering. So it's the same for all walks of journalistic life.
Yeah. Well, then you're not wasting your source's time, and you're also not wasting your time by asking redundant questions.
100%. But yeah, no, I am just dog shit at sports.
I'm sure you're not that bad.
I'm
You're better
pretty
than
bad.
me for sure.
I'm pretty bad.
All right. So our next question comes from Michael. So how do you identify what content should be reported in Canadian sports journalism, like sports reporting in the European Football League compared to the NHL?
It's a good question. I think a lot of it, again, there's not a science to it, but increasingly there is. That so if you're competing in a global economy, and you are now, like it's not just, again, if we can take it back to the old days of 15 years ago, there were 4 Toronto newspapers. So I was competing against when I was at National Post, I was competing against the Sun, the Star, and the Globe.
Yeah.
So if I had a real hot take on European football, maybe I could sneak it in there. Now I'm competing against, Sky Sports, BBC, and a whole bunch of other blogs and other experts all across the world. So that, if I'm trying to reach an audience of European football fans, am I, as a Canadian sitting here literally in my bedroom in Toronto, Ontario, Canada, going to have a real hot take on Real Madrid or how Bayern's going to do in the Champions League? Probably not. That there's a universality, there's a democratization of, the platforms, like what we're talking about here, that, right after I'm done talking to you, I can go and within 30 seconds find, Chelsea's game against Porto in the first round of the Champions League in 2004. Like, I don't need to follow a Canadian on that, even though they're reporting from across the Atlantic. So I think that's one part of it, that the audience can find the content they want. So you have to ask yourself, what can you be, what can you deliver that's better or unique to the audience that's in front of you, that you can reach. So I think that goes honestly a long way to deciding what gets covered. That, I'm here in Toronto. The Athletic Toronto crowd is based here in Toronto. So are we going to cover the Raptors, Leafs, Jays, Argos, TFC, missing somebody, Raptors, did I say Raptors? Or are we going to cover Inter Milan? Like, that's a big part of it. Like, we're here in Canada. We're Canadians covering Canadian sports for a Canadian audience. So I think that drives the bus in a lot of these.
Yeah. So while it's important to be broad and include some of those other things, it's okay sometimes to just report on what your audience will be interested in.
100%. Yeah. Like, I mean, there could be, if there's a Canadian who's playing in like the Champions League or Premier League or Serie A, Canadians have dabbled toes in there and told the Canadian story. Owen Hargraves or Paul Starteri, Christine Sinclair signed with the Chelsea women's team years and years ago. You do dabble into that, but there's no way. I shouldn't say there's no way. it's much more difficult to claim expertise when you're on this side of the Atlantic and all the things are happening on the other side.
Yeah. Awesome. All right. So our next question is from Meredith. If hockey is getting more expensive for youth to join, what is going to be the next big sport?
That's a really good question too. All of these are really good questions.
I agree.
Adults can fuck up anything.
Mm-hmm.
Like we really can. We can fuck up anything we touch. And we're talking about hockey here, but all of youth sports is getting really expensive. That I don't know if anybody here watching or if you were saying competitive swimming.
I was actually.
Were you in competitive swimming?
Yes.
So like that's not cheap either.
Not at all. No.
And how far would you have to go for meets, and how often would you have to go for meets?
We had meets. They normally ran 2 weekends, so we normally had like a Saturday meet and a Sunday meet. So you were exhausted. And we would go to like Barrie, like Peterborough. Sometimes we would have them in like Niagara Falls. It was like a lot of time, and just I can't even financially imagine what that was like for my parents. It was insane, I'm sure.
Did you have a small group coach? Did you have your own personal, like not a personal coach, but it was a small group, like the coach?
Yeah, small group,
kids,
yeah.
Right? Like, so that's not cheap either. They're not probably volunteering.
No, absolutely not.
So you have the time away from work. How often did you practice?
3 nights a week.
So 3 nights a week, you have meets. I mean, the equipment's not super expensive, but like the coaching and all that stuff is, and the time commitment. So, so if you have a kid in competitive swimming, you're like, well, you want to hear a story about hardship, listen to this bullshit. Like, you have to go to now the Pan Am pool. If you're in Toronto, the Pan Am pool out, on the border of Pickering is probably where you're going to be stationed a lot of the time.
Yeah.
If you have a child in competitive dance, which is, again, a fabulous pursuit that promotes physical literacy, physical fitness, teamwork, super, super awesome pursuit, but also really goddamn expensive that, again, you're traveling, you have to invest in time. You're in gymnastics, expensive, coaching, time, travel. So yeah, we can sit here and say, well, soccer is not as expensive. Well, no, at the house league level, it's not, and neither is hockey. The challenge is once you take that next step up the ladder, that rep soccer for 8-year-olds here in Toronto is still $1,500 for 4 months on the cheap level. Basketball, again, you say, well, all you need is a basket and a ball and a pair of shoes. But if you want to play a level above house league, it gets really expensive. Hockey is getting noticed and getting dirt piled on it, in part because it didn't used to be that way. The folks like Tom Cochrane wrote a whole song about it, right? Like Big League in the 1980s about the only way out of this cold northern town is by playing the game. Well, unless that kid in the cold mining town has a personal skating coach, a skills development coach, a proper dietary plan, and an agent, like that kid's not going anywhere.
No, absolutely.
So, we're sitting here picking on hockey, but really this is also a broader problem. The reason I'm picking on hockey is because what hockey used to represent isn't any of what we're talking about.
Yeah. I think it's also because it's such a national sport to Canada, such a national treasure, that it almost seems bizarre that it's not more inclusive, even in just the financial realm of it.
Yeah, no, and it's not inclusive socially, it's not inclusive financially, but it's easy to say hockey is a problem. The problem is adults. The problem is that we're pouring a whole bunch of money into this.
Yeah, and we're willing to, and we'll keep doing it.
Yeah, I just thank Christ that neither of my kids can swim that well.
Yeah, I would imagine so.
Yeah.
All right. One last question from our audience. This one's from Michael as well. So what is your opinion on professional athletes kneeling down during the national anthem?
Give her. Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's a huge sacrifice, as we've seen. Standing up for your beliefs and being principled. It's not easy. It's courageous. What Colin Kaepernick did, what Megan Rapinoe continues to do, it takes guts. And you have that huge platform. You can reach and influence millions of people. Like the original Instagram influencers played sports. You can influence a huge swath of society. You can cut down through all the Twitter noise, all of the stuff by these gestures, these symbols. So absolutely. But unfortunately, there's going to be repercussions, and we've seen that. But if you strongly believe in something, I will never hold it against an athlete for advocating what they believe in.
And I think that that's a really important message to send to even just young athletes, or maybe even people that don't consider themselves athletes who just enjoy the sport. It's important to always make sure that you're putting yourself and your beliefs ahead of what anybody else is going to tell you.
Agreed.
And I think that goes for journalism as well, putting what you believe you and your audience deserve to know before necessarily anything else.
Hopefully without the physical fitness component of that, but yes.
Yes, I agree. All right, Sean, thank you so much. That's it for all of our audience questions. Thank you for taking the time to be here today. And we really enjoyed hearing from you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Awesome, no problem. We'll just end our stream now.